The moment Elias Calloway told her to prove she was strong enough to survive the mountain, Clara Whitmore's hands stopped shaking, but her eyes betrayed everything she was trying so desperately to hold together. The year was 1873, and the Rocky Mountains of Colorado Territory did not care whether you lived or died. The peaks rose sharp and white against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the pine forests below them were dense enough to swallow a person whole without so much as a whisper of warning. Settlers had been pushing westward for decades now, and the railroads had stitched new life into the land. But up here, above the mining towns and the cattle trails and the telegraph lines, the wilderness remained untamed and utterly indifferent to human suffering. It was exactly the kind of place a man like Elias Calloway could disappear into. And it was exactly the kind of place a woman like Clara Whitmore should never have been standing alone. She had arrived in the town of Hartwell, Colorado Territory on a Wednesday morning in early October, riding in the back of a freight wagon, because she could not afford the stage, and because pride, she had long since learned, was a luxury that cost more than it was worth. Hartwell was a rough little cluster of buildings that had sprung up around a silver mining operation 2 years prior, and it wore its youth badly. Unpainted timber storefronts, muddy streets that turned treacherous with the first frost, a saloon that never seemed to close, and a general store run by a man named Orville Potts, who had the peculiar habit of weighing your character before he weighed your goods. The mountains loomed behind the town, like a wall that God had built to remind everyone down below just how small they truly were. Clara climbed down from the wagon with a canvas bag over one shoulder, a small leather trunk that had belonged to her mother, and the kind of determined expression that people wear when they are absolutely terrified but refuse to show it. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with brown eyes that caught the light like river water in late afternoon, and a face that carried both beauty and hardship in equal measure. She had come from Missouri, from a life that had unraveled thread by thread over the past 2 years, and she had come because her uncle, Theodore Whitmore, had written to her in the spring and told her there was work to be had managing his boarding house in Hartwell. What he had not written, what she discovered within 40 minutes of arriving, was that Theodore Whitmore had died of a fever 6 weeks ago, that his boarding house had subsequently been claimed by the man he owed money to, and that there was, in fact, no work waiting for her at all. She stood in the street outside the defunct boarding house with the October wind pulling at her hair and the first thin fingers of a mountain cold settling around her shoulders, and she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. She had spent the last of her money on the freight wagon. She knew no one in this town, and a winter in the Colorado Rockies, as even the most charitable soul in Hartwell would have told her, was not a season you faced without shelter, provisions, and a considerable measure of luck. It was Orville Potts, bless his habit of weighing character before goods, who eventually told her about the Calloway place. "Up on the eastern face, about 4 miles out," he said, leaning on his counter with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned not to get involved in other people's troubles, but cannot quite help himself. "Elias Calloway's been up there since about 69. Trapper mostly. Does some guiding work in summer for the survey crews. He's not what you'd call a sociable man, Miss Whitmore, but he's not cruel either. And he's got a cabin big enough for 2, or so I've heard it said by those who visited." "Has anyone visited recently?" she asked. "Not recently, no." He paused. "He did come down last month for supplies, and he mentioned he might be looking for someone to help with the winter stores, preserving mostly. He's never been much of a cook, and he had a fall last season that still gives his left knee some trouble." Clara Whitmore looked at the mountains, then at the canvas bag in her hand, then at the sky, which was doing something in the northwest that she recognized even from Missouri as the preliminary maneuvers of serious weather. "Which trail?" she asked. Orville Potts gave her directions with the kind of thorough reluctance that meant he knew it was likely a terrible idea, but respected her enough not to say so out loud. She was halfway up the eastern trail, her trunk abandoned at the livery in town because it had become clear within the first mile that she could not carry it 4 miles up a mountain when the snow started. Not the gentle floating snow of illustrated Christmas cards, but the sharp, sideways, mean-spirited snow of a Rocky Mountain October that had apparently decided to skip straight past autumn and arrive at full winter without pausing for pleasantries. The wind dropped the temperature with brutal efficiency, and the trail, which had been dirt and pine needles at the base, became increasingly treacherous as the elevation rose. She was thinking, with surprising clarity, that she might actually be about to die on the side of a mountain in Colorado Territory for the crime of trusting a letter from a dead uncle when she heard the sound. Not a sound from the wind, or from the trees thrashing in the storm, or from the wildlife that she had been nervously aware of since leaving the last visible landmark behind. A different sound entirely. The deliberate, unhurried sound of large boots on rock, moving with the confidence of someone who had walked this particular piece of ground so many times that the storm was irrelevant. And then Elias Calloway stepped out of the trees. She understood immediately why Orville Potts had described him the way he had, not unkind but not sociable either, because the man who emerged from the tree line looked like the mountains themselves had decided to take human form. He was enormous, not in the soft way of a man who simply carries weight, but in the hard, angular, deeply earned way of someone who had spent years in physical contest with a wilderness that did not believe in compromise. He stood at least 6 feet and 2 inches, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the narrow trail entirely, and the heavy fur-lined coat he wore did nothing to disguise the sheer volume of muscle that moved underneath it. His arms, even through the coat's thick sleeves, spoke of the kind of strength that came from splitting wood and hauling game and surviving winters that broke lesser men. His hair was dark brown, nearly black where the snow had dampened it, and it fell past the collar of his coat in a way that suggested scissors were a tool he encountered infrequently and regarded with suspicion. His jaw was strong, squared at the corners and darkened with several days of growth, and his eyes, even from 10 feet away and through a wall of wind-driven snow, were a startling, pale gray-green, the color of mountain ice in the very first light of morning. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that does not belong in the landscape he knows, not hostile, but deeply, carefully evaluating. "You are on a private trail," he said. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard. "I am looking for Elias Calloway," she said, and was quietly proud of how level her own voice came out, given that her feet had gone numb sometime in the last quarter mile. "You found him," he said. "Who are you?" "Clara Whitmore, Theodore Whitmore's niece. I arrived in Hartwell this morning to take up work at his boarding house, only to find that he has passed and the house has been taken. Orville Potts told me you might have need of someone to manage winter stores." She paused. "I realize this is not a conventional approach to employment." Elias Calloway looked at her for a long moment, in which the snow continued to fall with complete indifference to either of them. His gaze moved from her face to the canvas bag over her shoulder to her boots, which were decent quality but plainly inadequate for a mountain in October, and then back to her face. "Can you prove you're strong enough to handle a mountain winter?" he asked flatly. "Because if you cannot, I'm sending you back down this trail before you get yourself killed." There it was. Not asked unkindly, she would note later, lying awake in the strange, fire-lit warmth of a room she had not expected to be sleeping in that night. Simply stated, as a practical matter. Show me your strength. Prove you belong here. The mountain doesn't care about your circumstances, and neither can I. She opened her mouth to answer, and what came out was not the composed, rational argument she had assembled during the last 4 miles of uphill hiking in a snowstorm. What came out was a sound that she had been holding back for approximately 2 years, since her father's death, and the loss of the farm, and the long grinding humiliation of depending on cousins who made it clear they were providing charity rather than family, and the desperate hope of a letter from a dead uncle, and the last of her money spent on a freight wagon, and the trunk she had left at a livery because she simply could not carry it anymore. What came out was a single sob, and then the tears came with it, sudden and total, the way a dam gives way, not gradually, but all at once. She pressed her lips together immediately and looked away from him, furious at herself, blinking hard against both the snow and the shameful, uncontrollable wet blur of her vision. Elias Calloway went completely still. In 6 years on this mountain, he had faced bears, blizzards, a rockslide that had taken 3 feet off the western edge of his clearing, a summer wildfire that had come close enough to turn the air bitter with smoke, and one very ill-advised confrontation with a pair of men who had been poaching on survey-marked land. He had not, in any of those situations, felt what he felt in this moment, which was an utter and complete inability to proceed with whatever he had been about to do next. The woman was not weeping theatrically. She was not asking for sympathy or deploying tears as a strategy. She was simply losing the fight to contain something enormous that had been pressing against the inside of her chest for a very long time, and doing it on the side of his mountain in a snowstorm, with her feet most likely going numb in inadequate boots. And the combination of her dignity and her exhaustion and the specific quiet devastation of those tears hit Elias Calloway somewhere deep in his chest with the force of something he had no useful name for. "Come on," he said. His voice had changed. She could hear it even through the storm. He reached down and took her canvas bag from her shoulder without asking. She was too tired and cold and undone by her own tears to argue. He turned back up the trail, walking with that same unhurried certainty, and she followed him, wiping her eyes with her sleeve and feeling simultaneously grateful and humiliated and too cold to properly experience either. His cabin was another half-mile up the trail, and when it came into view through the trees, it was nothing like what she had expected. She had pictured a rough, dark, barely habitable structure, the kind of place where survival was the only decor. What she found instead was a solid, well-built log cabin with a proper covered porch, a neatly stacked woodpile that ran the length of the eastern wall, smoke rising from a stone chimney, and a sense of careful, purposeful order that spoke not of luxury, but of a man who took the maintenance of his domain seriously. There was a small barn off to the left, built with the same attention to practical solidity, and through the barn's partially open door, she could hear the sound of animals, at least one horse and what sounded like goats. Inside the cabin, the heat hit her like a wall, and for a moment she simply stood in the doorway and let it soak into her frozen fingers and her numb feet and the tight, cold knot of misery that had lodged itself between her shoulder blades sometime around mile 2 of the trail. The interior was one large room with a sleeping loft above it, accessed by a sturdy ladder. The main room held a stone fireplace of considerable size along the north wall, a heavy table with 2 chairs, a series of shelves stacked with provisions, tools, pelts in various stages of preparation, and books, more books than she would have expected, arranged with something approaching care along the highest shelf. There was a wood stove in the corner with a cast iron pot hanging above it, and the smell of the place was pine smoke and leather and something warm and indefinably inhabited, the specific scent of a space that one person has occupied with complete attention for a long time. Elias set her bag down near the door and moved to the wood stove without ceremony, checking the fire with the practiced efficiency of a man who managed heat the way other men managed livestock, attentively, consistently, with no drama. "Sit down," he said. "Get those boots off. Your feet need warming." She sat in one of the chairs at the table and began unlacing her boots. Her fingers were clumsy with cold. He produced a blanket from a wooden chest near the fireplace and dropped it around her shoulders before she had finished with the laces, and the gesture was so matter-of-fact and yet so unexpectedly kind that she felt the threat of tears again and suppressed it with everything she had. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "Later," he said. "Warm up first." He put a tin cup of something hot in front of her, coffee, black and strong, with a slight bitterness that suggested he had been making it for one person for a very long time. She wrapped both hands around the cup and drank it in small, careful sips, and felt the mountain cold begin to retreat. He sat across from her eventually, folding his large frame into the other chair with a controlled deliberateness that she would come to understand was simply how he moved, not slowly, but completely, as though he did not do anything by half measures. He had removed his outer coat, and without it he was, if anything, even more imposing. The flannel shirt he wore beneath was rolled to the elbows, and his forearms were corded with muscle, mapped with the particular landscape of someone who had spent years doing hard physical work in a harsh environment. There was an old scar along the left side of his jaw, thin and long, and another on his right forearm that she noticed and then looked away from because staring seemed impolite. "Tell me about the boarding house," he said. So she told him. She told him about the letter from Theodore and the journey from Missouri and arriving in Hartwell to find nothing but a dead uncle's debts and Orville pots in his directions and the trail in the snow. She told it plainly, without self-pity, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Theodore Whitmore was a decent man, he said finally. I bought supplies from his store, years back, before the mining came and he opened the boarding house. He was the kind of man who meant well, but couldn't quite manage the practical side of things. That is a generous summation, she said, from someone who had to hike 4 miles in a snowstorm because of his well-meaning impracticality. Elias looked at her. There was something in his expression that might, on a different face, have been called the beginning of a smile. On his face, with its strong jaw and those pale, careful eyes, it was more like a slight shifting of the landscape, a tectonic suggestion of warmth. You can stay, he said. There's a loft, privacy. I do need the help with the stores. I meant that. What I told Potts. My knee slows me down, and the preserving and the drying and the winter preparation takes more time than I can manage well alone. He paused. It won't be easy. A mountain winter is not a gentle thing. I grew up on a farm in Missouri, she said. I've been preserving, curing, and managing winter stores since I was old enough to reach the top shelf of the cellar. I'm not afraid of hard work. I know, he said quietly. She looked at him. How do you know? You met me 20 minutes ago. You walked 4 miles up an October mountain trail, alone in the beginning of a storm, he said. With a bag you clearly packed for something better than this, and you didn't ask me to feel sorry for you. There was a silence between them then, but it was not an uncomfortable one. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people recognize something in each other that they cannot quite name yet. I will earn my keep, she said. I don't doubt it, he said. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls with increasing enthusiasm, and the fire in the wood stove ticked and settled, and Clara Whitmore, who had woken up that morning with nothing but a dead uncle's broken promise and a freight wagon ride, found herself sitting in the warmth of a stranger's cabin on the side of a Colorado mountain and feeling, for the first time in 2 years, that she might actually be going to be all right. She was not yet in love with him. That would come later, built as carefully and inevitably as the woodpile along the eastern wall, one log at a time, each one placed with intention until the structure became something that could carry the weight of a winter. But she did notice, as she finished the coffee and the blanket settled more firmly around her shoulders, that Elias Calloway had not sent her back down the mountain. And she thought that perhaps that was the beginning of everything. The first week was purely functional. They developed an arrangement with the efficiency of 2 capable people who recognize that survival is better managed as a shared project than a solo endeavor. She took over the cooking entirely, which Elias accepted with the particular relief of someone who has been eating their own meals for 6 years and knows they are not doing it well. His provisions were substantial. He had been a thorough and experienced hunter and gatherer, but they lacked organization. And the first thing Clara did was inventory everything with systematic care, cataloging what they had, what they needed, what needed to be preserved before the deep cold set in, and what order those tasks should be accomplished in. He watched her do this without comment, but she caught him watching, in the way you watch someone who is doing something you hadn't expected them to be able to do, with a kind of quiet reassessment happening behind the eyes. He spent his days checking and resetting his trap lines, a circuit that took him out each morning before full light and brought him back by midday, and in the afternoons he split wood, made repairs to the cabin and barn, and attended to the animals. A solid chestnut horse named Cooper, 2 milk goats, and a trio of chickens that lived in a corner of the barn with the philosophical resignation of chickens everywhere. Clara worked in the cabin, processing the game he brought back, setting the herbs and roots she found in his provision stores to dry, rendering fat, making the kinds of preparations that her mother had taught her and that now came as naturally as breathing. They ate together in the evenings, and at first the conversation was sparse and practical, the state of the trail, the weather forecast read from the sky, and the behavior of the animals, what needed doing the following day. But there was something about the evenings, about the quality of the firelight and the silence of the mountain around the cabin and the small domesticity of 2 people sharing a meal, that made conversation happen in spite of the mutual preference for quiet. "You've read all of those?" she asked on the fourth evening, looking up at the shelf of books. "Most of them twice," he said, without looking up from the hunting knife he was sharpening. "Which is your favorite?" He was quiet for a moment. "Dana," he said. "2 years before the mast. I've never been near an ocean, but there's something in it. The way a man can be completely alone in a thing that's larger than him and still find himself equal to it." She looked at him for a moment, this enormous, quiet man with the scarred jaw and the careful eyes, sharpening his knife by firelight with the focused unhurry of someone who had all the time the world possessed. "I understand that," she said softly. He looked up then, and their eyes met across the table, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "What made you come west?" he asked. It was the first personal question he had asked her since the first night. She told him about her father, a farmer, a good one, who had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1871, leaving the farm mortgaged and the debt non-negotiable. She told him about the cousins in St. Louis and the 2 years of dependent, half-welcome habitation in other people's houses, and the grinding indignity of needing people who made you feel the weight of their generosity every single day. She told him about Theodore's letter and what it had felt like to read it. Hope, real and solid and warm, a door opening in a room that had felt closed for a very long time. She did not tell him about crying on his trail. They both knew it had happened. Neither of them had mentioned it, and she was grateful for that, though she was not quite sure why. "What made you stay?" she asked. "On the mountain, I mean. You clearly could do other work." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I was in the war," he said. "Union, Kansas Regiment. I was 19 when it started. By the time it ended, I found I didn't have much use for crowds." He paused. "Up here, a man is accountable to himself and to what's around him. The mountain doesn't ask you to be anything but competent. I find that I prefer it." She nodded. There was nothing in this that required a sympathetic response, and she was wise enough to know it. "That seems like a reasonable preference," she said. He looked at her with that slight landscape shift of almost warmth, and she thought that for a man who claimed to prefer solitude, he seemed remarkably at ease with her company. The days settled into a rhythm that Clara found, to her own considerable surprise, deeply satisfying. There was something about the absolute clarity of mountain life, the plainness of the tasks, the immediacy of the needs, the way that warmth and food and shelter were not abstractions, but things you created with your hands each day, that cut through the fog of grief and displacement she had been living in for 2 years and replaced it with something solid. She was useful here. More than useful, she was necessary, and she had not felt necessary in a very long time. She learned the cabin's needs the way she had learned her father's farm, not by being told, but by watching and inferring and occasionally making mistakes that taught her more than instruction would have. She learned that the chickens required checking twice because the latch on their corner of the barn had a loose pin that needed reseating periodically. She learned that the goats, whose names turned out to be Ida and Millicent, had distinct personalities and specific preferences for which of them received attention first, and that failing to observe this hierarchy resulted in Ida systematically eating everything within reach in what was clearly a protest action. She learned that the coffee needed to be started before Elias came back from the trapline, or he would drink it cold without complaint in a way that she found, for reasons she could not entirely explain, thoroughly unacceptable. She also learned things about him that he did not say directly. She learned that he read by firelight most evenings until late, long after she climbed to the loft because she could see the glow beneath her floor planks and hear the occasional very quiet sound of him turning a page. She learned that he had a habit of going out to the porch in the early morning before starting his trapline circuit and standing in the cold for 10 or 15 minutes in a silence that was clearly deliberate and not passive. She learned that his knee, which he never complained about, gave him real trouble on the steeper sections of the eastern trapline because she watched him favor it in ways he clearly did not realize he was favoring. She said nothing about the knee, but she started putting a small tin of the arnica and tallow salve she made from the dried arnica root she'd found in his stores on the table each evening within easy reach, without comment. The first evening it appeared, he looked at it without touching it. The second evening, it was in a slightly different position, and she knew he had used it. He did not thank her. She did not require thanks. What she did not account for, what crept up on her with the same quiet inevitability as the mountain winter, 1 degree at a time, was the way that competence admired turns into something else entirely when it is accompanied by kindness, and particularly when the person demonstrating that combination is built like a cathedral and has eyes the color of a winter ice, and occasionally, very rarely, smiles with his whole face in a way that makes the rest of the world seem slightly less important. It happened on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after she arrived, when she had gone out to the barn to check on Ida and Millicent and found the latch on the barn door frozen solid in the overnight cold. She spent 10 minutes working at it with her fingers before admitting defeat and going to find Elias, who was at the woodpile. "The barn latch is frozen," she said. He came without a word, carrying the small iron tool he used for exactly this kind of thing, and worked the latch free with 3 precise motions that she recognized as the product of having done this specific task many times. But then he turned to look at her hands, which were red from the cold and from 10 minutes of working a frozen latch. "Inside," he said. "Warm them up." "I'm fine. Your hands are half frozen." He paused, and something passed through those gray-green eyes that she could not quite read. "Please," he added, and the word seemed to cost him something, as though it was not a word he used very often. She went inside. He followed, and he brought her to the wood stove, and he held her hands in his to warm them, which was a practical gesture of no particular significance, and yet Clara Whitmore stood in the firelight of Elias Calloway's cabin with her cold hands inside his enormous warm ones, and felt something shift in her chest with the finality of something that cannot be shifted back. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her hands, his expression its usual careful reserve, but there was color in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "They're warm now," she said softly. "Yes," he said, and let go slowly, and turned back to the wood stove as though checking the fire required immediate and thorough attention. She went back to her work. He went back to the woodpile. They ate dinner that evening in a silence that was slightly different from the silences before, and when he passed her the bread across the table, their fingers brushed and both of them pretended not to notice. It was around this time that Tom Braddock appeared, and with him came the first serious trouble of the winter. Braddock was not a man who announced himself quietly. He arrived at Elias's cabin on a Thursday afternoon on a sorrel horse that he was riding too hard for the weather, and he knocked on the door with the particular rhythm of someone who is used to knocking on doors and having them opened immediately. Clara answered, because Elias was still on the trapline's north circuit and not due back for an hour. Braddock was in his mid-30s, with a broad face that might have been handsome in a rougher arrangement and a smile that arrived before the warmth reached his eyes. He wore good clothes for a man out on a mountain trail, a decent coat, a relatively clean hat, and he carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had money and expected that money to do his social work for him. "Tom Braddock," he said with a smile. "I'm looking for Calloway." "He's out on his trapline," Clara said. "He should be back within the hour." Braddock looked at her with a particular attention that she recognized and did not care for. "And you are?" "Clara Whitmore. I manage the house." "Manage the house," he repeated, in a tone that made the phrase sound like it meant something else. "Calloway never mentioned having company." "He doesn't strike me as a man who mentions things unless asked," she said pleasantly. Braddock laughed, genuine enough, but with an edge in it. "That's true enough. Can I wait inside?" She stepped back and let him in because it was cold, and because telling a man he could not wait inside when the man in question was waiting for the person who owned the cabin was the kind of discourtesy that created problems. She offered him coffee and he accepted it and looked around the cabin with the careful eye of someone assessing an inventory. "Ah, you've tidied the place up," he observed. "It needed tidying," she said. "How long have you been here?" 2 weeks. He looked at her again with that particular attention. "Long way from anywhere, for a woman alone." "I am not alone," she said. "I am with Elias Calloway." Something moved in Braddock's expression that she could not quite name but instinctively disliked. He said nothing further, and she returned to the bread she was making and they waited in a silence that was considerably less comfortable than the silences she shared with Elias. Elias arrived 40 minutes later with a brace of rabbits over his shoulder and stopped in the doorway when he saw Braddock at his table, in a way that was absolutely still for exactly 1 second before he came inside. "Braddock," he said. "Calloway." Braddock stood and extended a hand, which Elias shook with the minimal courtesy of a man who is being polite as a matter of principle rather than feeling. "I've come about the Harker Creek land." "I told you in August what my answer was," Elias said, hanging the rabbits by the door and removing his coat. "My offer has improved since August," Braddock said, "considerably. My answer hasn't." Clara moved to the far end of the cabin to give them some privacy, though the cabin's single room made privacy a relative concept. She focused on the bread with determined attention. Braddock's improved offer, it emerged over the next 20 minutes, was a proposition to purchase a strip of land along Harker Creek that ran through the lower section of what Elias considered his territory. Not legally deeded, she gathered, since homestead claims in this part of Colorado Territory were still a tangle of mining company agreements and federal survey, and the practical reality of whoever had been living somewhere long enough to call it theirs. Braddock wanted it for access to a silver vein that his assay man had apparently identified on the far side of the creek. Elias did not want to sell it. He said so clearly, without heat, in the exact tone of a man who has said the same thing multiple times and is not interested in saying it again, but will do so out of courtesy. Braddock left eventually, with the smile still in place and nothing resolved, and the sound of his horse on the trail faded into the general noise of the wind in the pines. Elias stood at the window and watched him go with those pale eyes that revealed very little but held everything. "He's been trying to acquire that creek access for 8 months, he said, not turning around. "He doesn't seem like a man who accepts no easily," Clara said. "He is not," Elias agreed. He turned then and looked at her, and something in his expression was careful in a different way than usual, as though he was thinking about something he hadn't entirely decided to say yet. "You should know what you've come into. If he continues to push on this, it could become difficult. He has money, and money out here has leverage." "Does he have legal standing?" "Not yet. But legal standing in Colorado Territory in 1873 is a complicated business. What he has is the ability to file a competing claim, pay a lawyer, and make the process unpleasant for a long time." She looked at him steadily. "Are you concerned?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling you because you have a right to know what you are in the middle of," he said, "not because I don't think I can handle it." "I know," she said. "I didn't think you were telling me because you couldn't handle it." He looked at her for another of those moments that lasted slightly longer than was purely informational. Then he nodded, once, and went to see to the rabbits. That night, lying in the loft with the fire banked low below and the mountain wind pressing against the cabin walls and the faint sound of Elias moving in the room beneath her, Clara thought about what it meant to be in the middle of something with a person. She had been in Missouri, surrounded by cousins in their comfortable, conditional pity, and she had been profoundly, deeply alone. She was here, in a one-room cabin on a mountain in a territorial dispute, 4 miles from the nearest town, with one person who had known her for 2 weeks, and she was the least alone she had been in 2 years. She fell asleep, thinking about his hands. November settled over the mountain with serious intent. The snow deepened, and the cold sharpened itself on the night air until stepping outside before dawn required a kind of full-body commitment to endurance, and the tasks of daily life became defined by the management of warmth and the conservation of resources. Clara had grown up with farm winters, but a Colorado mountain winter at elevation was a different category entirely. It had a weight and a comprehensiveness that you felt in your bones, a cold that was not hostile but was completely, absolutely uncompromising in its requirements. She and Elias worked in close partnership now, the way that two capable people adapt to the rhythms of shared space and shared necessity. She knew when to talk and when not to. She knew that he came back from the trapline some mornings in a silence that needed to be respected, and others in a quiet openness that welcomed conversation. She knew that he fixed things before he was asked, that he checked on her safety in indirect ways, ensuring there was always enough wood inside before he left each morning, making sure she knew where the rifle was and how to use it, which she had demonstrated to his evident and restrained satisfaction one afternoon when he had asked her to show him. "Where did you learn to shoot?" he asked, after she had put 3 shots into a tin can at 30 yards. "Missouri," she said. "My father believed in practical education." He was right, Elias said. She liked that about him, the absolute absence of the kind of surprise men often displayed when women demonstrated competence. He did not seem surprised. He seemed confirmed, as though he had already suspected this and was simply receiving information that supported his existing assessment. On a Saturday in mid-November, they had their first real disagreement. She had decided, with what she felt was entirely reasonable logic, to take the shorter route to the eastern water source alone, while Elias was dealing with a difficult section of the north trapline that had been disrupted by what appeared to be a rival predator, possibly a mountain lion, moving through the area. The shorter route was not technically difficult. She had walked it a dozen times with him. The longer route added 40 minutes in each direction in temperatures that had dropped significantly overnight. He came back to find her there at the water source with the 2 carrying buckets, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen before. Not anger exactly, but something close to it, a controlled intensity that was clearly taking effort to keep in that register. "I told you to take the long route," he said. "The long route is an unnecessary hour and 20 minutes in a temperature that dropped 6 degrees overnight," she said. "I've walked this route 12 times. "You have walked it 12 times with me," he said. "There's a mountain lion actively hunting this side of the slope. I told you that this morning. You told me it was likely concentrated around the north trapline area." "Likely is not certainly." He picked up both buckets without asking and started back toward the cabin. "The mountain lion moved 2 miles east of the last confirmed sighting overnight. I found the tracks this morning on the north run. You were within half a mile of a possible hunting path." She followed him, her jaw set, feeling simultaneously annoyed and aware that he was not wrong. "You cannot keep me in the cabin like a provision box," she said. "I am not keeping you anywhere," he said, his voice still measured but with an edge in it. "I am asking you to take reasonable precautions in a situation I know better than you do. That's not confinement. It is asking you to trust my assessment." She was quiet for a moment. "You are right," she said finally, and he was so clearly surprised by the directness of this concession that he almost stopped walking. "You do know this mountain better than I do, and I should have followed your guidance on the route. I was impatient with the cold, and I let practicality override judgment. I am sorry." He was quiet for a moment as well. "I should not have used the tone I used," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I understand it." They walked the rest of the way back to the cabin in silence, but it was a different silence from the one that had preceded the argument, warmer, more resolved, the silence of 2 people who have had their first real disagreement and found that the other person is capable of handling it with fairness. Inside, he put the buckets down and turned to look at her. "I'm not accustomed to being responsible for another person," he said. It came out carefully, like a man navigating a landscape he knows to be treacherous. "I find I have become concerned with your safety. I'm not entirely sure what to do with that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not accustomed to having someone be concerned with my safety," she said. "I find I don't mind it as much as I expected." Something in his face shifted with that tectonic suggestion of warmth, stronger now, and for a moment they simply stood on opposite sides of the small cabin, looking at each other, and the fire ticked in the wood stove, and outside the wind found a gap under the door and sent a brief cold thread across the floor that neither of them noticed. It was the first time either of them acknowledged anything directly, however obliquely, and both of them understood it. Braddock came back in late November, and this time he brought company. There were 2 other men with him, one a wiry, watchful type that Clara recognized from the way he held himself as the kind of person who settled problems physically, and the other a soft-handed man in a coat that was too good for mountain trail riding, who introduced himself as Aldous Pierce, Esquire, which told you everything you needed to know about why he was there. Pierce laid out a legal filing he had prepared with the Territorial Land Office in Denver, a competing claim on the Harker Creek Strip, based on the argument that the land had never been formally homesteaded and therefore remained available for appropriation under the mining claim provisions of the 1872 Federal Mining Act. Elias read it. He read it with the careful attention of a man who does not rush through things because rushing leads to mistakes, and when he was finished, he set it on the table and looked at Braddock. "This is a legal document," he said, "which means my response to it needs to go through legal channels. I'll need to go into Denver." "Naturally," Braddock said with a smile. "Of course, the process takes time, and in the meantime, the claim stands as filed. If you'd prefer to avoid the complexity and the expense—" "I would not," Elias said. Braddock looked at Clara, who was standing near the wood stove, making herself useful with the appearance of complete neutrality. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "you seem like a practical woman. Perhaps you could advise your employer on the wisdom of accepting a fair offer." "I manage the house," Clara said pleasantly, "not the land. I would not presume to advise on matters outside my knowledge." The wiry man near the door was looking at the interior of the cabin with the specific kind of attention that is not admiration. "When will you go to Denver?" Clara asked Elias after they had gone. "I'll have to wait for a break in the weather," he said, "and I'll have to leave you here." "I can manage here," she said. "I know you can," he said, and then he looked at her in a way that was different from all the other ways he had looked at her, a way that was not practical or assessing or careful reserved, but something more direct and more exposed. "I still don't like the idea of it." She met his eyes. "How long will you be gone?" 3 days at minimum, 5 possibly, if the territorial clerk is backed up." "I will be here when you come back," she said, "every provision in order." "That's not what I'm worried about," he said quietly. It was the second time they had spoken around the thing without speaking directly to it, and this time the air in the cabin felt considerably warmer than the wood stove could account for. He left on a Tuesday in the last week of November, when the sky had cleared to the sharp, brilliant blue that followed a storm and the trail was firm underfoot with packed snow. He saddled Cooper with the efficient economy of a man preparing for a serious errand, loaded the legal document and his winter coat, and came back inside once to verify that she knew where the second rifle was and that the latch on the barn was properly seated. "I will send word with anyone heading up from Hartwell if I'm delayed," he said. "All right," she said. He stood at the door with his hat in his hand, and there was a moment, just a moment, where he seemed to be deciding something. Then he put his hat on and went out, and she heard Cooper's hooves on the packed snow trail diminishing toward town, and the cabin was very quiet. She worked. She was not afraid, not exactly, but she was acutely aware of the size of the silence around the cabin without him in it, the way that his presence organized the space in ways she had not consciously noticed until it was absent. She checked the animals twice a day, kept the fires banked, continued the preserving work, and read in the evenings from his shelf of books. She found a worn copy of Washington Irving's Western Sketches that she read by firelight, with her feet near the stove and the wind making its professional commentary outside. Braddock's wiry companion came on the second day. Not Braddock himself, just the wiry man, who knocked and stood in the doorway and said he'd come to check whether there was anything Miss Whitmore needed in Calloway's absence. The offer was delivered with a smile that was meant to be reassuring, and was not. "Nothing, thank you," Clara said, and kept her body positioned so that her right hand was within reach of the rifle that was propped against the wall beside the wood stove. "I am fully supplied." "Mr. Braddock is concerned about a woman alone on the mountain," the man said. "Mr. Braddock need not concern himself," she said. "I am quite well, and Elias will be back within a few days. You may tell Mr. Braddock I said so." The wiry man's eyes moved to the rifle. He smiled again with a different quality. "Capable woman," he said, and went away. She told Elias about it when he returned on the 4th evening, coming through the door with snow on his coat and the particular expression of a man who has spent 4 days navigating bureaucracy and is relieved to be home. She had supper on the stove, a proper meal, the best she could make from the stores, not because she needed to prove anything but because she had wanted to. He stood in the middle of the cabin taking in the warmth and the smell of food and the neatly ordered space, and something in his face went through a change that was quieter and more profound than any expression she had yet seen on it. "How did the filing go?" she asked. Well enough, he said. I have a territorial attorney named Howard Beam working on the counterclaim. He is thorough, which matters more than being quick. He hung his coat. The judge in Denver is a fair man, from what Beam tells me. We have a hearing date in February. He looked at her. Now tell me about the visitor. She told him. He listened without interrupting, but she watched his jaw go slightly harder as the story progressed. He came here to assess whether you were alone and would stay that way, Elias said. Yes, she said. I believe so. He won't come back, Elias said, with a certainty that was not bluster, but simply knowledge. I'll make sure Braddock understands that sending people to this cabin while I'm away is not acceptable. How will you make sure he understands that? By telling him, he said simply, clearly enough that he has no reasonable grounds to misinterpret it. She nodded. She did not doubt that Elias Calloway saying something clearly was, in fact, sufficient clarity. Supper was different that evening from all the other suppers. The absence and return had changed something, had clarified something that had been accumulating in the particular way that unavoidable things accumulate, quietly and persistently, until one day they are simply undeniable. He sat across the table from her, and they ate the stew she had made, and at some point the conversation moved away from Braddock and Denver and the legal claim into other territory entirely. What did you do before the war? She asked. Farming, he said. My family had land in Kansas. I was 17 when the war started in '61, so I had about 2 years of farming as an adult before everything changed. Did you go back? After the war? I went back, he said. Stayed for about a year. Found I couldn't settle. Went west. He was quiet for a moment. The farm was my father's life. It felt wrong to try to make it mine when I had become someone different from the person who had grown up there. Do you miss it? She asked. Not the farm specifically, but having roots somewhere permanent. He considered this with the thorough honesty he brought to everything. I thought I didn't, he said. For a long time I was certain I didn't. The mountain satisfied something in me that the farm never had, the scale of it, the completeness of it. He paused. Lately I have been less certain. She looked at him across the table, in the firelight, with the winter pressing against the cabin walls and the supper plates between them. Less certain that you don't miss it? She asked. Less certain that solitude is what I actually prefer, he said, looking back at her, or simply what I had become accustomed to. She was very aware of her own heartbeat. I have become accustomed to a great many things in the past month, she said carefully. As have I, he said. There was a silence, and then he reached across the table and set his hand over hers, large and warm and certain, and she turned her hand over under his and felt his fingers close. Clara, he said. Yes, she said, which was not technically an answer to a question he hadn't asked yet, but covered it precisely. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and in the firelight of the cabin that she had organized and made warm, and made into something that she realized now had started feeling like home weeks before she had allowed herself to notice, Elias Calloway kissed her for the first time, with the same thoroughness and care and complete commitment that he brought to everything he did. It was a proper kiss, an honest kiss, one that acknowledged everything that had been accumulating between them and made no apology for any of it. When they separated, she kept her hands pressed flat against his chest, his very broad, very solid chest, and he kept his hands at her waist, and they looked at each other in the way that people look when they have stopped pretending. I should tell you something, he said. Tell me, she said. I thought you were going to die on my trail, he said, that first day, and something in me that I was not prepared for simply refused to allow that. Something in you carried my bag, she said. Yes, he said. I suppose that was the first part of it. She laughed, a real laugh, warm and sudden, and he smiled in response with his whole face, the way she had only seen rarely, and it was as magnificent as she had anticipated. December was a different kind of month entirely. The cold deepened to a seriousness that made October feel like a warm afternoon, and the snow accumulated on the mountain in layers that transformed the landscape into something sculptural and absolute. But inside the cabin, the winter was the warmest thing Clara had ever lived through. They were cautious about it, both of them, careful with the newness of what had happened between them, the way you are careful with something that matters. They did not change the practical structure of their days, because the days still had to function and the mountain still required attendance. They still rose early and worked hard and ate together and worked through the evenings. But the space between them had changed, had compressed into something warm and deliberate, and every task shared between them carried a different weight now. He touched her hair in the mornings when she was standing at the wood stove starting the coffee, just a brief certain brush of his hand over the top of her head that communicated something with no words at all. She brought him the arnica salve, still but directly now, sitting across from him at the table in the evenings, and sometimes, if his knee had been bad on the trail, insisting with a firmness that he accepted with what she recognized as genuine relief at being permitted to be cared for. They talked more. Long conversations in the evenings by the fire, covering the large territory of two people who have been alone for a long time and have accumulated things that need telling. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 16, and who had been the kind of woman who made every room she entered into a home purely by inhabiting it. He told her about a friend he had made in the war, a man from Vermont named Samuel Cole, who had been the funniest person Elias had ever met, and who had been killed at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and the way that laughter had become for a long time afterward, associated with loss. "You don't seem like a man who laughs easily," she observed. "I seem to laugh more easily recently," he said, looking at her. She felt heat in her face that had nothing to do with the wood stove. He went to visit Braddock on a clear December day, riding down to Hartwell and finding his way to the good quality room Braddock kept at the hotel there. She did not know exactly what was said, because he did not repeat it word for word when he came back, but he told her that Braddock understood the situation clearly now, and there was something in the quality of his calm when he said it that convinced her Braddock had, in fact, understood. Orville Potts confirmed, when Elias stopped at the store for supplies, that Braddock's wiry companion had left Hartwell that morning with his bedroll and horse, heading east. Braddock himself remained, but the particular aggressive energy of the man had apparently receded somewhat. "Whatever you said to him," Clara said that evening. "I was polite," he said. "I believe you," she said. "I also believe that polite from you carries a particular weight." He did not disagree. Christmas came to the mountain with a full blizzard that sealed them inside for 3 days, and was the finest Christmas Clara could remember in years. He had brought back from Hartwell, on a trip in mid-December that he had conducted with unusual purposefulness, a small supply of molasses and dried currants and cinnamon, which she recognized as the components of a Christmas pudding, and which he had clearly requested from Potts without quite knowing how to explain what he was doing. "Orville Potts told me you might want to make something special," he said, unloading the supplies with studied casualness. "For the season." "Did he tell you what I would want to make?" "He made a suggestion," he said. "I followed it. She made the pudding and a spiced bread and roasted a grouse he had brought in from the south trapline, and they ate on Christmas Day with the blizzard raging outside and a small candle on the table and the fire built high. He had placed on the table beside her plate a small carved figure, a mountain fox no larger than her hand, made from pine with a level of detail and patience that spoke of many evenings of quiet work that she had not been paying sufficient attention to. She picked it up and looked at him, and felt something in her chest so large and warm and completely without precedent that she did not have words for it, and did not try to find them. "When did you make this?" she asked. "Evenings," he said, "when you were reading. You have been working on this for weeks." "The detail required time," he said, with a careful neutrality that she saw straight through. She set the fox down gently on the table and leaned across and kissed him on the cheek, and he caught her hand when she would have sat back down and held it against his face for a moment with his eyes closed, and the gesture was so entirely unguarded and so quietly tender that it undid her completely in the best possible way. January brought the February hearing closer, and with it a renewed seriousness about the legal proceedings. Howard Beam, the Denver attorney, sent a letter in early January that Potts brought up with the regular mail run, outlining the strength of their counterclaim and the precedent cases he intended to cite. Elias read it twice and gave it to Clara, who read it and noted that Beam seemed both thorough and confident, which was indeed what mattered. There was also a letter from one of Elias's former summer survey clients, a federal land surveyor named Augustus Halverson, who had heard about the competing claim and offered, in his capacity as a man who had done extensive survey work in this precise area, to provide written testimony regarding the long-established use and occupancy of the Harker Creek corridor by Elias Calloway. This, Beam's letter indicated, was precisely the kind of evidence that would be most useful. "Halverson has always been a fair man," Elias said, setting the letters on the table. "He knows this land as well as anyone." "It sounds as though you have a strong case," Clara said. "Strong doesn't always win," he said, "but honest usually does, eventually, even out here." He looked at her and she saw something in his face beyond the legal question, something personal and considered. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The hearing is in Denver on February 14th. I would like you to come with me. Howard Beam wants to meet us both," and he paused and she watched him choose his words with the same care he gave everything. "I would not like to go without you." "You would not like to go without me," she said, a smile starting at the corner of her mouth. "No," he said. "I would not." "Then I will come," she said. The preparation for the trip to Denver took the better part of a week, partly for practical reasons. The cabin and animals needed to be arranged for several days of absence, which meant asking a man named Garrity from a farm 2 miles down the slope to check in, and partly for reasons that neither of them mentioned directly, which was that traveling together to Denver with a shared attorney and a shared legal interest and a shared sleeping arrangement to arrange was a different kind of thing from sharing a cabin on a mountain. It was Elias who addressed it on the evening before they were to depart. "I want to speak plainly," he said, which was not a sentence that needed to be said, as he generally spoke plainly, but she understood what it meant in this context and waited. "I intend to ask the attorney if he knows whether the Justice of the Peace in Denver has time in his calendar on February 14th, he said, after the hearing. She looked at him across the table. "That is also Valentine's Day," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was aware of that. I didn't plan it exactly, but I don't consider it a disadvantage." She stood up slowly from her chair, and he stood as well, because he always stood when she did, and she looked up at him, at this enormous, careful, scarred, pine-scented, impractical boot-buying, fox-carving, trail-walking man who had stood between her and the winter in the mountain and Braddock's legal claims and the general weight of a world that had not been particularly kind to her lately, and whom she loved with a completeness and a certainty that she had never felt for anything in her life. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am," he said. "You have asked me in the least romantic construction possible," she said, "and I find that entirely appropriate for who you are, and I would not change a single word of it." "Is that a yes?" he said, with the hint of something that was almost anxiety in those pale eyes, the first vulnerability she had seen in him since the evening she had held his hands at the wood stove. "That is absolutely a yes," she said. He took a long breath, and then he smiled with his whole face, bright and open and completely unguarded, and pulled her into his arms with the certainty of a man who has been holding something back for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to put it down. Denver in February was a different world from the mountain, loud, busy, smelling of horses and coal smoke and civilization, the streets still banked with snow, but teeming with the particular energy of a territorial capital that knew it was growing. They arrived in the evening and took separate rooms at a respectable hotel, and Elias sat across from her at dinner that evening, looking slightly, endearingly out of place among the indoor furniture and the electric lanterns and the other diners in their town clothes, the mountain in him not quite contained by walls and ceilings. "You look like a bear who has wandered into a parlor," she told him over the soup. "I feel like one," he said. She laughed, and he watched her laugh with an expression that she recognized now as love, as plain and as certain as the mountains themselves. The hearing the next morning lasted 3 hours. Howard Beam was, in fact, everything his letters had suggested, methodical and precise, and possessed of a quiet aggression that served him extremely well in a courtroom. Braddock's attorney, Pierce, was technically capable, but was arguing from a weaker position, as both Beam and Augustus Halverson, would come down from his survey post specifically for this, demonstrated with the kind of thorough, documented clarity that territorial judges found compelling. The judge ruled in Elias's favor on all substantive points. The Harker Creek corridor was confirmed as within the established occupancy and use territory of Elias Calloway, and Braddock's mining claim was denied access. It was not a complete surprise. Beam had been optimistic, but hearing the words said aloud and officially made the relief physical, and Clara felt Elias's hand tighten on hers under the table. Outside the courthouse, in the February cold with the Denver sky white with cloud above them, Elias turned to her with an expression she had come to love entirely. "Now," he said. "Now," she agreed. The justice of the peace was a small, cheerful man named Nathaniel Ware, who performed the ceremony with evident pleasure in a room adjoining the territorial courthouse. Howard Beam and his clerk served as witnesses, Beam with the dignified smile of a man who approves of what he is witnessing, and the clerk with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had not anticipated his Wednesday, including a wedding. They stood before Justice Ware in their travel clothes, both of them exactly themselves. She in her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had packed with this very moment in mind, and he in the clean flannel and dark vest that represented his best effort at formal occasion, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Do you, Elias John Calloway, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Justice Ware asked. "I do," Elias said, and looked at her when he said it, not at the justice, and the weight of those two words was everything she had ever needed. She said her own words with equal certainty, and when it was done and the papers signed, Elias kissed her in front of Howard Beam and his clerk and the justice of the peace with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, and Howard Beam said, with professional dignity, "Congratulations to you both." And his clerk started clapping and then stopped and looked embarrassed, and Clara laughed into her new husband's shoulder. They went back to the mountain on February 17th, taking a slightly more comfortable pace on the return than the urgency of the journey down had allowed. The trail from Hartwell was familiar to them both now. She had walked it in a snowstorm the first time, and in steadily deepening knowledge every time since, and as they climbed together through the pine forest toward the cabin that sat at the top of it, the February light golden and sharp on the snow, she felt the specific pleasure of returning to a place that is entirely and completely yours. Garrity had done a good job with the animals. Ida and Millicent were unimpressed by the brief absence, but willing to forgive in exchange for their morning ration. Cooper went directly to his stall with the dignified relief of a horse who has made his feelings about extended travel clear. The cabin was cold but structurally perfect, and Elias had the wood stove roaring within 20 minutes, and Clara put water on for coffee and stood in the middle of the main room of their home and looked around at the books on the shelf and the table with its 2 chairs and the fire in the stove and the carved fox that still sat on the windowsill where she had placed it on Christmas Day, and felt something so settled and so permanent and so complete that it was almost frightening in its fullness. "Well," said Elias from behind her, and she could hear the smile in it. "Well," she agreed, and turned and walked straight into the embrace of his arms. Spring came to the mountain in April, slowly and then all at once, the snow retreating from the lower slopes first, then the middle elevations, the creeks running high and fast with melt water, the pine forest filling with birdsong that had been absent since October. There was a quality to the spring light in the Rockies that was unlike anything Clara had known in Missouri. Sharper, brighter, almost surgical in its clarity, as though the winter had cleaned the air of everything superfluous and left only what mattered. She and Elias worked the spring preparations with the same partnership that had characterized the winter work, only now with the particular ease of 2 people who have moved past the cautious negotiation of cohabitation and arrived at genuine fluency. They understood each other's rhythms and working styles and the specific vocabulary of their shared life, the shorthand that develops between people who pay attention to each other with real care and real consistency. He was expanding the trapline territory, taking advantage of the survey knowledge he had accumulated from years of guiding work to push further east into areas that had not been worked recently. And she had begun a kitchen garden in the south-facing clearing below the cabin, a proper garden, ambitious in scope, because her mother's voice in her memory insisted that a woman who could grow things would never truly go hungry, and because she found genuine pleasure in the work of it. They received a letter from Howard Beam in late March, confirming that Braddock had accepted the court's ruling and withdrawn all competing claims. He had apparently also left Hartwell, relocating to Pueblo, where a new mining venture was apparently more promising and more legally straightforward. Orville Potts confirmed this with a note of his own, appended to the letter with his characteristic attention to practical detail. "Gone," Clara said, setting the letter on the table. "Gone," Elias confirmed. She had not realized, until that word, how much of a background weight the Braddock situation had been carrying throughout the winter. Not a constant anxiety, but a low, persistent note, like a sound you stop hearing consciously, but whose absence is immediately perceptible. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up from the supply inventory he'd been working through. "This has been the best year of my life," she said, which is surprising given how it started. He set down the inventory. He looked at her with those pale gray-green eyes, the ones that she had seen in every mood and every light now, that she knew as well as she knew her own reflection in still water, and he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. "The same," he said, which from Elias Calloway was the equivalent of a sonnet. In May, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, when he came in from the early porch time, the deliberate silence of his beginning-of-day ritual, and came inside to find her standing at the wood stove with the coffee made and her hands around her own cup, and something in her face that made him stop in the doorway. "Clara," he said. "We are going to have a baby," she said. The transformation of his face in that moment was the most magnificent thing she had ever witnessed. Not a gradual shift, not the tectonic suggestion of warmth she had watched in the early weeks, but a complete, sudden, wholly unguarded breaking open of something that had clearly been waiting to be born in him for a very long time. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her up, carefully and completely, and held her against his chest in the enormous warmth of his arms, and she felt him take a very deep breath. "A baby," he said, into her hair. "In December, I think," she said. "December," he repeated, and she could feel something in his chest that might have been a laugh, or might have been the particular sound a man makes when joy is too large to stay quiet. The months that followed were busy and purposeful in a new way. There were preparations to make that went beyond the usual winter work, additions to the cabin to consider, the careful management of her health at altitude, and the practical question of medical access. They arranged, with the cooperation of a doctor in Hartwell named Philip Marsh, who had come west from Philadelphia 2 years prior, with good training and a genuine vocation, a plan for the later stages of the pregnancy that balanced her comfort with proximity to care. Elias built an addition to the cabin in July and August, with the focused intensity of a man with a deadline that mattered more to him than anything he had ever built. It was a proper room off the west end of the main space, small but solid, with its own small window and a thick door and walls that he chinked with extra care against the winter wind. Clara watched him work with a pride that she did not try to hide, and occasionally a concern that he was doing too much in the July heat, which he accepted without argument when she pointed it out directly. "Sit down," she said one afternoon in early August when he had been working since before dawn, and the temperature had climbed to the kind of warmth that was unusual at this elevation, but not unheard of. "I need to finish the window frame," he said. "The window frame will still exist in an hour," she said. "Drink some water and sit down for 20 minutes. He sat down and drank the water and looked at her over the rim of the cup with an expression that was somewhere between amused and resigned. "You have become very certain," he said. "I was always certain," she said. "I simply had less standing to act on it." "And now?" "Now I'm your wife and the mother of your child and the manager of this household, and when I tell you to sit down and drink water in the August heat, I have both the authority and the genuine concern to back it up." He drank the water. He sat for 20 minutes. Then he went back to the window frame, but he moved slightly more carefully than before, and she counted it as a satisfactory outcome. Their son was born on December 8, 1874, in the cabin that had started as a stranger's shelter and was now the most home Clara had ever known. Dr. Philip Marsh had come up from Hartwell 2 days prior when the signs suggested the time was close, and he was everything his arrangement had promised, capable, calm, and possessed of the particular gift of making a difficult process feel as manageable as possible. Elias was present for the birth in the way that the year and the place permitted, within call, in the main room, doing the very limited number of useful things available to him and managing his helplessness with the particular stillness of a man who is very strong and who has encountered something that strength does not address. When Dr. Marsh called him in, he came through the door and stopped. Clara was sitting against the cabin wall, tired and warm and absolutely luminous, with the baby in her arms. The baby was small and perfect and had his father's coloring already, dark hair, the suggestion of those pale eyes, and was making the specific sound of a person who has recently arrived and is assessing the accommodations. Elias knelt beside her with an ease that made nothing of his size and the knee that still troubled him sometimes, and he looked at the baby and at Clara, and his face did the thing again, the breaking open, the complete unguarded fullness of it. "He has your jaw," she told him. "He has your hands," he said very softly. She put the baby into his arms with total confidence in the care with which those arms would hold him, and Elias held his son for the first time with the kind of absolute attention he gave to everything that mattered, and Clara watched him and felt the full measure of what the past 14 months had been, the trail in the snowstorm, and the frozen latch, and the mountain lion tracks, and the firelight conversations, and Denver, and the courthouse, and Justice Ware, and Christmas, and the carved fox still on the windowsill, and the spring garden, and the summer edition, and this specific, irreplaceable moment. "What shall we name him?" she asked. Elias was quiet, looking at the baby with those pale eyes. "Samuel," he said. She remembered the story he had told her, the man from Vermont named Samuel Cole, who had been the funniest person Elias had ever known. "Samuel," she said. "Yes, Samuel Calloway." Elias looked at her over the baby's head, and there was something in his face that she thought would stay with her for the rest of her life. Gratitude and love, and something that looked like a man who has found the thing he had stopped believing he was looking for. The years that followed built upon each other the way the mountain itself had been built, slowly, massively, through the patient accumulation of what mattered. Samuel grew from a dark-haired, serious-eyed infant into a boy who followed his father on the trapline as soon as his legs would carry him that far, and listened to his mother's reading in the evenings with the focused intensity of someone who understands that stories are how the world makes sense of itself. In the spring of 1877, their daughter Ruth was born, a red-haired, loud-voiced child who arrived in the world with visible opinions and the particular energy of someone who intends to use all of it. Samuel regarded his sister with the careful, watchful consideration of a 4-year-old encountering something unprecedented, and then, when she grabbed his finger with her tiny hand, made a sound of such complete surprise and delight that Clara laughed until she cried. The cabin grew again because it needed to. Elias added a proper sleeping room for the children in the summer of 1877, and a larger barn in 1878 when the goat herd expanded from 2 to 6 and the chickens had evolved from a trio to a genuine operation. Clara's kitchen garden expanded to a proper kitchen garden and beyond, producing enough in the summer months to trade with Garrity's farm and the 2 other homesteads that had developed on the lower slope during the years of the mining boom. Orville Potts came up to the cabin for supper twice a year, at harvest and at Christmas, which was more human traffic than Elias generally welcomed, but which Clara had established as a tradition before he had quite noticed it happening, and which he had come to anticipate with something that he would never call pleasure, but that served the same function. Hartwell grew. The silver mine ran strong through the mid-70s, and then began its slow decline in the early 80s, and the town adjusted around this the way frontier towns do. Some people left, some stayed. New commerce replaced the mining economy with ranching and the burgeoning freight trade, and the Calloway name became part of the known geography of the eastern slope in the way that only years of honest presence can create. Howard Beam sent a note from Denver in 1879, enclosing a newspaper clipping about Tom Braddock's business dealings in Pueblo, which had apparently come to a complicated end involving a mining dispute of a different kind, one in which Braddock was not the aggrieved party. Clara read it and showed it to Elias, who read it and set it aside without particular comment. There was no satisfaction in it that needed saying aloud. The mountain and the creek and the life they had built remained exactly as they were. That was enough. In the evenings, through all those years, the cabin had its rhythms that were the rhythm of their life together. The fire in the wood stove, the coffee, the books on the high shelf, more of them now, added over the years from Potts's store and from Beam's law office and from Hartwell's slowly developing small library. Samuel reading by the fire, then Ruth beside him. Elias's large hands doing the same careful work they always had, mending tack, sharpening tools, making the small carved animals that had become, without either of them entirely planning it, a family tradition. The fox on the windowsill had been joined over the years by a bear, 2 rabbits, a mountain lion that he had made for Samuel on the child's 5th birthday, and a small goat with Ruth's name scratched on its underside in Elias's deliberate handwriting. She found him on the porch one evening in the September of 1880, standing in the early night air in the way he had always done, the deliberate stillness, the particular quality of attention he gave the mountain around them. Samuel and Ruth were asleep. The stars over the Rockies were the kind of stars you only saw at altitude, outrageously numerous and close, indifferent and magnificent. She came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders without looking away from the mountains, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him and looked up at the sky. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was always quiet when thinking about something that deserved honesty. "I was thinking," he said, "about a woman I found on my trail in a snowstorm, and what would have happened if I had simply sent her back down." "You could not have sent her back down," she said. "You tried to." "I did try," he agreed. "I failed immediately." "You failed," she said, the moment she cried. "Yes," he said, "I did." She looked up at him, at the profile she knew as well as she knew anything in the world. The strong jaw, the scar, the dark hair threaded now with the first hints of silver at the temples that had started appearing in the past year. The gray-green eyes looking out over the mountains with the same careful, comprehensive attention they had always given everything. "I am glad you failed," she said. He tightened his arm around her shoulders. "As am I," he said. Below them, the mountain fell away toward Hartwell and the lights that were just visible in the valley, and beyond that, the dark rolling country that ran east toward Missouri, and a life that felt as remote and as insubstantial as a dream you can barely remember by mid-morning. Above them, the peaks rose white and certain against the night sky, the same peaks she had looked at from the street of Hartwell on the morning she had arrived with nothing and found, without expecting it or planning it or being remotely prepared for it, everything. She turned and kissed her husband on the jaw, near the scar, which was something she had done 10,000 times and which she intended to do 10,000 more, and he turned and held her face in his large, warm hands and kissed her properly in the September dark on their porch on their mountain, and the stars continued their magnificent indifference overhead, and the cabin behind them held the sleeping weight of their children, and the carved fox sat on the windowsill inside in the low firelight, small and detailed and made with patience and love, the first of many things and the beginning of all of it. They stood on the porch for a long time after, in the companionable full silence of two people who have been learning each other for 7 years and have found the work entirely worthwhile, looking out at the mountains they knew and the sky they loved, and the cold September air wrapped around them without malice, and the night was very large and very quiet and very good. And in the spring of 1882, when Samuel was 7 and Ruth was 5, and the cabin's addition had grown to accommodate a second new room, and Clara's garden had spread to a size that Garrity's wife came up once a week to help tend, and the trapline ran clean and full and well, and Elias's knee hardly troubled him at all anymore, since she had insisted on the arnica preparation not merely as a courtesy, but as a standing requirement, and the Hartwell had grown enough to have a proper schoolhouse that both children would attend in the fall. In that spring, a woman arrived in Hartwell on the freight wagon from the east, stepping down into the muddy street with a canvas bag over her shoulder and the kind of determined expression that people wear when they are absolutely terrified and refuse to show it. Orville Potts, behind his counter in the general store, watched her come through the door and recognized something he had seen before, and leaned on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned that some situations require a specific kind of guidance. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for work," she said. "I was told in Denver that there might be opportunities in this area." Potts looked at her and looked at the mountains out his window and thought about what he knew of the homesteads on the eastern slope and who might be in need of reliable help. "Let me tell you about a place up on the eastern face," he said, "about 4 miles out. Good people up there. They might have work, and they've been known to take in someone who needs a fair start." The woman looked at the mountains through the store window, and the mountains looked back with their usual impeccable indifference. And somewhere up on the eastern trail, in the cabin with the woodpile along the eastern wall, and the fox on the windowsill, and the children's voices, and the smell of coffee and pine smoke and home, Elias Calloway was splitting wood in the afternoon light, and Clara Calloway was standing at the door of the cabin watching him with the same particular expression she had worn for 7 years now, the one she had never bothered to explain, because it explained itself. The mountain endured. The seasons turned, and the life they had made together on its slopes, one careful, certain, hard-won day at a time, was exactly as solid and as permanent as the ground beneath their feet.